All right, so let's dive into this deep dive. This is going to be a fascinating one. We're talking about land ownership and historical claims to land. And yeah, this is one of those things that gets people fired up. But we're going to be looking at a source here, and it's specifically about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, just want to say up front, we're not picking sides here. Our goal is to just really unpack the ideas and let you guys decide what you think about all of this.
I think one of those interesting things is the way this author starts out. They start out with this really personal story, and they talk about their ancestral village in Africa. It was conquered 700 years ago. And the descendants of both the conquerors and the conquered still live there today, bound by this ancient covenant that even dictates who they can marry.
They can't get married.
They're framed as cousins under this agreement, and marriage is forbidden.
Wow, so something from literally centuries ago is still impacting their lives today. That's incredible.
And that's where the author poses this really challenging question. What if, someone whose family left that village, hundreds of years ago, showed up and said, hey, this land is mine? Would that be legitimate?
I mean, that would be pretty wild. It really makes you think about, how far back do these claims go?
It does. And the author uses this analogy to examine historical claims to the land that is now Israel. They kind of take us through the history of the Jewish people. They're exiled by Assyria and Babylon, followed by the Persians, the Greeks. Each group kind of leaving its mark on the region's people and culture.
And that really shows you that history isn't just a fixed thing, right? It's not just one group coming in and that's it forever. There's all these migrations and cultural mixing happening all the time.
Definitely.
And, I was reading that even during Jesus' time, there were so many different Jewish communities that they barely recognized each other.
Right.
So, it's not this unchanging thing.
Yeah, it challenges that whole notion of a fixed connection between a people and a place. You have to think even language changed so much. Like Aramaic.
Right.
What other aspects of their identity changed over time?
That's a good point. So we've got this super long and complicated history, and then the author gets to their main point, which is kind of a controversial one, right?
Yeah, it is. They basically argue that for descendants of Jews who left centuries ago and built lives elsewhere, to now claim the right to return and maybe even displace current inhabitants is, well, they use the word outrageous.
Outrageous. Wow, that's a strong word.
It is.
And they don't stop there. They talk about, there's no certificate of occupancy from ancient times. They even ask, does any Jew today actually know the exact spot their ancestors might have farmed, centuries ago? It is. It makes me think about, can you really draw a straight line from, way back then to now?
And it gets even trickier when the author brings in religion. What about using religious texts to back up claims to land? They even flip the script. They say, what if other groups use their own religious texts to do the same thing? How would we feel about that?
That's a good point. It makes you think about, are we holding everyone to the same standard? If we wouldn't accept that from someone else, can we really accept it for ourselves? It really makes you think critically. But then they throw in another wrench, right? They're Canaanites. Okay, for anyone who's wait, who are they?
So the Canaanites were in that region even before the Israelites. But we're talking way, way back in the timeline here.
Okay, even further back. Got it.
And, even in the Bible, you have figures like Uriah the Hittite and Ahithophel who were descended from Canaanites, and they're right there in the story.
So they were already there. Wow.
So if we're talking about ancient connections, they predate everyone else we've been talking about.
So then the whole idea of who was there first gets even more complicated.
Exactly. It really throws a wrench into the whole thing. And then they end with this mind-blowing question. What if we could prove that Canaanite descendants are still around today? Could they come back and say, hey, this is ours?
Wow. Talk about a historical puzzle. So we've got all these layers of history and culture and claims and claims and claims. Where do we even begin to untangle this whole thing?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. It really is like peeling back the layers of an onion, right? Each layer you peel back, there's a whole new set of, complexities.
Yeah, it's making me rethink everything I thought I knew about history, how people connect to a place. And what really struck me was that point about how cultures change over time. You don't just have one group replacing another. There's all this mixing and blending. So it's not just conquest and then boom, new culture.
And that makes it so much harder to like draw lines between groups and their claims to a territory. The author mentions like even the languages. It's that during Jesus' time, Aramaic and Greek were more common than Hebrew.
Wow, really?
That's a huge change.
Yeah,
It makes you think the reality was a lot more fluid than we imagined.
yeah, like it's not so simple. And it makes you wonder, is it even possible to go back to some kind of, pure ancestral homeland? Like, can you even do that?
It's definitely a romantic idea, but when you look at the actual history,
It's way more complicated.
way more complicated. And that brings up another big question, right? How do you square our modern idea of land ownership with a past where like borders were constantly changing, conquest was happening all the time, and cultures were just like mixing together constantly?
Yeah, it's like today we have deeds and property lines and whole legal systems built around this idea of like, this is mine, that's yours. Very clearly defined.
Right.
But back then, it doesn't sound like it was like that at all.
Really, it's a tough one. And this author is really pushing us to think about whether, our modern ways of thinking about this, are they even the right tools to use when you're talking about these ancient claims?
I'm starting to see that. So like, if our modern legal systems aren't the answer, then what is? Where do we even go from here? How do you even begin to like untangle this whole mess and figure out what's a legitimate claim?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. I mean, this author doesn't give us like a solution or anything, but they do something really important.
Yeah.
They get us asking the right questions.
Okay, yeah, I see that. Instead of being like, here's the answer, they're making us think about like, what questions should we even be asking?
Exactly. So is it just about like who your ancestors were, who was there first? Or is it about who's been living there continuously? Or is it about something totally different? Like maybe the cultural connections, the stories, the experiences that tie people to a place.
And like, how do you even weigh all those different things, especially when you're talking about stuff that happened so long ago?
Yeah, that's where it gets really, really complex and where having like honest conversations is super important. You have to be willing to listen to people who see things differently, even if you don't agree with them. And you have to recognize that everyone's coming at this from a human place.
As we've been talking about this, I've realized it's not about picking a winner in some kind of history debate.
Right.
It's about recognizing that everyone's story is kind of woven into this.
Right. It's about acknowledging the history, the different groups of people who've lived there, the mixing of cultures, and like that basic human need to belong, which connects us all.
And as much as these conflicts feel like they're from the past,
Right.
they still have real consequences for people today.
Absolutely. And so as we try to deal with this stuff, we have to ask ourselves, like, how do we approach these conversations? How do we do it with empathy and a genuine desire to understand?
That's a good point. This deep dive has really made me think. And honestly, I had a much simpler view of land ownership before we started talking about this.
Yeah, it's easy to oversimplify, especially with stuff that's so emotionally charged. But this piece is really pushing us to move past that, to deal with the nuances.
And even though it doesn't give us easy answers, it does give us something pretty valuable. It gives us a way to think critically about these issues, to question what we think we know, and to have better conversations about land, about belonging, about history.
It reminds us that, like, understanding is a journey, not a destination.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. As we kind of wrap things up here, I wanted to get your take on something the author brings up. It's this idea that these claims to land, they're not just like abstract ideas, they're really personal, tied to like people's identities, their sense of belonging, and that makes it even harder to talk about, right?
It does. It's like one of the biggest challenges with this whole topic. How do you even have a conversation when people are coming at it from such different places, when it's so tied up with who they are, how they see history?
It's like a minefield. The wrong thing. Exactly. So how do we even approach something like this?
Well, it takes like a lot of sensitivity and a willingness to really listen. More than just like going back and forth in a debate. It's about saying, okay, I see where you're coming from, even if I don't agree. And remembering that at the end of the day, we're all human.
This whole deep dive has really been a journey for me. And honestly, I have to admit, I'm walking away with more questions than answers. But maybe that's the point, right?
I think you've hit on something really important. It's not about finding like the perfect answer or solving these conflicts that have been going on for centuries. It's about being curious asking questions, and being open to different ways of seeing things. And I think that's how we start to find some common ground, some way to move forward together.
Yeah, I think you're right. This source has really challenged me to think differently about land, history, and what it means to belong. And it's a conversation we all need to be having. So to everyone listening, I'd say, keep exploring these questions. Check out different perspectives. Talk to people. Yeah. Because ultimately, it's not about winning an argument. It's about understanding the layers of history, the different cultures, that human need for connection, which goes beyond borders, beyond time. So as we wrap up here, I want to leave you with one last thing to think about. The author asks this question: what if we could prove that Canaanite descendants are still out there? Would they have a claim to the land? But I think the bigger question is, how do WE define a legitimate claim? Especially when we're talking about something that happened so long ago. What matters most? What can we learn from the past to help us deal with these issues today?
Great questions. Keep those in mind. Remember, understanding is a journey. It's not a one-time thing. It takes reflection, empathy, and a willingness to engage with the messiness of it all.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive on land ownership and historical claims. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration. Hey, you made it this far, so thank you for watching. Please support the work of this channel. Like this video and share. Subscribe to get notified when new videos are posted. I would like to know your thoughts on this topic. Please share them in the comments section. We can learn and grow together. If you have a topic you would want us to discuss, please send us an email. God bless you.